Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, everybody. Can I start by acknowledging parents, students, teachers up and down the country who have felt the disruption caused by the current COVID-19 outbreak. I know that they have been eagerly awaiting decisions around whether we would be making any decision to shift term dates. And I have released a statement this morning confirming that after considering all of the different factors, we will be leaving the school holidays the same for Auckland and for the rest of the country. It is a difficult decision because I acknowledge that it is not easy trying to learn from home. It is also not easy for teachers trying to teach from home. Many of them will be teaching from home whilst also caring for their own children. And there's a lot of disruption caused by COVID-19. We've worked very hard to try and assist there by providing digital devices, hard packs of materials and so on, so that learning from home can continue. And ultimately, when I considered all of the different factors here, the most logical decision was to keep the school holidays as they are. So I'm happy to get straight into questions.
This means at least 9 weeks at home with your kids, doesn't it, for Auckland parents?
Look, what I would point out is that New Zealand schools over the last 18 months have had probably one of, if not the lowest rate of closure in terms of schools across the OECD caused by COVID-19. Having said that, any closure of schools puts strain on households, whether it's the households of the kids, the households of the teachers. It is a really difficult time. So I acknowledge that, and that was certainly front of mind in making this decision.
Are you concerned about the impact on children's learning?
I am concerned about the impact COVID-19 has on children's learning. As I said, I take heart from the fact that our elimination strategy has meant that our schools have had less disruption than almost every other country in the OECD. Having said that, any disruption still has the potential to have an effect on learning. Last year we saw relatively good performance educationally from our students despite the lockdown and the disruptions caused by the lockdown. We have been putting additional support in place and we'll continue to do that because I acknowledge that it's a pretty difficult time.
Can you please just walk through the justifications for not moving the Auckland holidays?
I think everybody has been looking for certainty, and I wanted to be able to give people certainty there. There is some difficulty with shifting school holidays from a legal standpoint, for starters. If we were to shift the school holidays at this point, schools in Auckland would have the choice as to whether or not they went with the new school holidays or the existing school holidays. And that could create even more disruption in Auckland with some schools opting in and some schools opting out. So that was certainly a factor. I also acknowledge, though, that the teaching community have been continuing to work right the way through the lockdown period and supporting learning from home. And they will need some time to prepare for learning back in the classroom again, which does require additional preparation. It's a time of year where there is a lot of assessment taking place, and there's, both students and teachers need time for that. So time to complete assignments, time to mark assignments, and all of those sorts of things, which typically happens during the school holiday. So I factored that in as well. There was strong resistance from the teaching community and from school leaders. We got through the principal groups some survey information from schools across the Auckland region that suggested that there was a strong degree of opposition to shifting the school holidays. That was one of the factors we've considered, absolutely not the only one though.
What are your sympathies for parents who are having to spend those 9 weeks at home working, teaching in a confined space for that long?
Look, I acknowledge working from home when you've got children, particularly if they're younger children, is a really, really challenging time. And to some extent, you're not so much working from home as you're at home trying to work. And I do ask all employers up and down the country to keep that in mind when they're thinking about the expectations that they have of their employees who are trying to work from home. They may not be as productive as they would be if they were in the workplace because they will be juggling a whole lot of other things as well. I acknowledge that it's difficult. Unfortunately, shifting the school holidays isn't ultimately the solution for that.
And what do you reckon the chances are that everyone will get a holiday come school holiday time?
Look, it's still too early to tell on that one. It's still a bit of water to flow under the bridge. I'm not giving the COVID update today. The Deputy Prime Minister will be here in another sort of 3/4 of an hour or so to give the daily information on that. I'm encouraged with my other hat on, but obviously I'm not doing the case reports today.
How did vaccination rates weigh into your decision?
One of the things that schools did feed back as part of our feedback loop process was that another couple of weeks to give the chance for Aucklanders to get an even higher rate of vaccination is something that they are enthusiastic about. We're seeing really good uptake of vaccinations in Auckland, and another couple of weeks will give them even more time to do that. So yes, that was a factor. Look, it wasn't the deciding factor by any stretch of the imaginations, but it certainly is one of the advantages of having the school holidays stay where they are.
National have called for some basic assurances for future lockdowns about how school holidays would operate. Is that something that the government could issue?
It's very difficult to give assurances around future lockdowns and the circumstances under which they might occur and what might happen and what the consequences of that might be. As we move into a more highly vaccinated world, and certainly a much higher proportion of the New Zealand population being vaccinated, then our response measures will likely look different where we're faced with COVID-19 cases in the community. And the government has been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking on that. You saw that with the reconnecting work that we talked about before this current outbreak. And there's a lot of discussion that's been had on that since that time, and you've seen the Prime Minister even in recent days make more comments about that. I'm not making announcements on that today, but it's not fair to conclude that what we're doing now is what we will always do. It absolutely won't be. Things will look different in the future.
School communities had to sort of wait this whole time and has been left hanging as to what this decision is going to be. When you made the in-principle decision, or you signalled that Auckland was going to be in lockdown for longer, could you then, or will you in the future, do the same thing for school holidays if we do get into this situation again?
I mean, I guess there's a lot to weigh up when you're making a decision about whether to shift the school holidays. Certainly, we'll always look and see if we can be more timely in the advice that we give to people whenever we can.
Evidence that you weren't as timely as you perhaps could have been?
With the benefit of hindsight, almost every aspect of the way we respond to COVID-19 highlights things where you could do them differently if faced with exactly the same situation again. The reality, though, is very seldom are we faced with exactly the same situation twice. Almost every situation we've dealt with here has been different.
Have you had any feedback from sort of students or families or whānau who are still struggling to get online, to get access to the learning materials, to have the internet and what they need?
Look, I acknowledge that learning from home is by far, it's a long way from ideal. It's much more difficult. Requires a lot more self-management from the young people doing it. Requires more parental intervention and supervision. It's harder for the teachers because they have to try and keep tabs of a whole lot of different learners all in different places. So it is not ideal. We try and do the best we can to support that through digital devices, internet connectivity, and actually where that can't be supplied, good old-fashioned workbooks, hard packs of materials, and hundreds of thousands of those have gone out as well. So look, we do our best to support learning from home. It isn't as good as learning at school. I don't think anyone would argue against that, but it is what we have to deal with at the moment.
Does the government weigh up at all whether it could get extra support out to parents who are, spending an awful lot of time at home?
Look, again, I acknowledge that it's tough going for parents who are having to spend time at home. As we step down alert levels, there are additional options that open up to them. The ability to extend your bubble, for example, for the purposes of childcare and supervision, those things become more possible as we step down the alert level. So there'll be a range of additional options that will open up as things continue to improve in Auckland, as they have already around the rest of the country. So school holidays is one thing, but there are a range of other things that do offer some hope for those families who are currently locked down at home doing the right thing and isolating.
Does there need to be some
last couple, yep.
Does there need to be some consistent guidelines or something around how schools operate in this model, so that there's not such discrepancies in the number of hours, for example, schools are engaging with kids?
In an ideal world, yes. Of course, our model of schooling in New Zealand is that schools are self-governing and they make their own decisions, for example, about whether they're going to use a particular online learning platform, or which platform they use, their model of teaching. But that's the same when kids are in classroom as well. There's quite a variety of different teaching methods, whether it's the modern learning environments where you've got team teaching happening, single cell classrooms where it's more one-on-one, different decisions around timetables and class sizes. Schools in New Zealand have a lot of freedom when it comes to making those sorts of decisions, as they do, and the decisions around how they support distance learning.
And looking ahead to when schools do finally go back in October, what will the vaccination look like at schools? Are there any plans underway to sort of get sites or mobile sites or roll them out at schools across Auckland?
We're seeing a really good high uptake in that 12 plus age bracket already. So a number of young people are already have either had their first dose or are booked in to get one. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the numbers of that with me. But I'm expecting that we will see good high uptake in that secondary school age bracket, at least of the first dose, before kids were back in the classroom again. So I'm encouraged by that. Reminder too that at level 3 there is still some possibility for senior secondary school students to be on site so that they can complete assessments and so on. It's a limited number, it's not an unlimited sort of reopening for senior secondary school students, but when we get to that point with Auckland, it will open up some possibilities for that to happen. And again, vaccination helps there. It's just that extra layer of protection that provides some more comfort.
But there's no plans to put vaccination sites in schools yet?
It's a difficult time of year to do vaccinations in schools because you've got those issues around assessment, around examinations, around mock exams as well, and all of those sorts of things that happen at this time of year, which are exams, for example, use the sorts of facilities that we would use for vaccination. So the school hall, for example, they're usually used for exam purposes and so on. So it's a difficult time of year for that, and it would actually just be another thing to load onto schools when they're already struggling, I think, to get through everything by Christmas. But the fact that we're not doing them on the school sites, or there may be some limited examples of that, but it's not a systemic program to do that. That doesn't mean that we're not very, very focused on that age cohort, though.
Does the ministry have any idea the scale of what the catch-up will be and how many kids, weren't accessing classes over lockdown and where they were in Auckland?
Schools will have a really good insight into the level of engagement they've had from their students. I, of course, whenever there is a lockdown, do get worried about kids re-engaging after that, so the potential for a higher rate of absenteeism after a lockdown. Last year we put about $50 million into re-engagement support so that schools could reach out into those communities and get those kids back into the classroom. And some of that money's still out there in the system now, it's still being spent, so that will help with re-engagement after this particular lockdown. In terms of support for those kids who have fallen behind and who may not be able to catch up by the end of the year, we have funded, last year and we will fund again this year, summer school, particularly for those senior secondary school students, so that if they fall behind and they don't complete their NCEA, they'll be able to complete it over the summer, so that those who are wanting to go on to tertiary study, they'll still have the opportunity to do that if they're willing to do a bit of catch up over the summer.
How bad did that non-re-engagement, or do you have any stats or figures about how many kids didn't come back? Or?
It's still quite patchy in terms of the data, so it's hard to draw hard and fast conclusions. But we continue to evaluate and to work on that. All right, you can have the last question.
So with the school holidays, is this like a blanket rule across all schools, or can some schools still make a decision based on the needs of their communities?
Look, one thing I would acknowledge is that particularly as you get towards the end of the school year for secondary schools, schools are often working quite hard to provide assessment opportunities for students. In that last school holidays, they'll probably have quite a few students on site during the school holidays, completing assignments, accessing facilities and so on. And I know secondary school teachers really work hard to support students to do that. In terms of our primary schools, they have out-of-school care programs. Many primary schools are connected to out-of-school care programs which use their sites during the school holidays. So there won't be no options. Right, thanks everybody.